Hey everybody, Dr. Segrin here with another video lecture, and here we're going to pick up where we left off. We'll be talking some about chemistry today, we'll be talking some about rocks today, and we'll be talking about the earth today. So this lecture is going to hopefully bring this all together. So let's jump right in. So we're going to call this lecture Introduction to Biogeochemical Cycles, and we'll focus on calcium today. And that word biogeochemical, it's a big word. It's one of the bigger words we'll see all year. And a lot of this lecture is just breaking down what exactly that means and illustrating it for you, because it is a very hard term to wrap your head around. But once you get this concept, it kind of changes your entire perspective on Earth. So one way we can begin to understand this big word is by breaking it down into different syllables and prefixes. And in environmental science, we generally say Earth is made up of, I guess, conceptually spheres, as I guess the Earth is a big sphere. Sorry, flat earthers. But our first kind of sphere of Earth, and you'll kind of get the picture once we go through them all, is the biosphere. And in general, anytime you see the prefix bio, that refers to life. And so the biosphere is all living things on Earth, like our picture here, the rainforest. You are included in this, so you are part of the biosphere because you are a living thing. And our next sphere we'll be talking about is the geosphere, and we've already been talking about this geosphere. That's all the rocks and the magma and the plate tectonics and the layers of the Earth and all that stuff that we have been talking about is the geosphere. And the prefix geo generally just refers to Earth, but a lot of times it also can just kind of refer to rocks or the kind of rocky aspects of Earth. That's what we mean by the geosphere. The atmosphere, well, atmo actually is a prefix that means air. So the atmosphere is all of the air that surrounds Earth, all the gases that make up our atmosphere. And the hydrosphere is basically all water on Earth, and just in general, the prefix hydro means water. Okay, I think we probably all knew that one. And lastly, this one's not used as much, but the cryosphere is all of the ice on Earth, and cryo means ice. So if you're cryogenically frozen, that means you're put on ice to preserve your body or something like that. You might have heard of that word before. All right, well, that hasn't really helped us understand the bigger word, the biogeochemical cycle word. In reality, it should probably be called biogeohydroatmochemical cycle. No, sorry. Biogeohydroatmochemical cycle. Usually it's been shortened to biogeochemical cycle, so we're not sounding like, Mary Poppins.
It's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious
With ridiculously long words, but let's break that down. Let's see if we can get a deeper meaning here. So bio is life, geo is rock, atmos is air, hydro is water, cryo is ice. Chemicals we know are things like elements and atoms and molecules, all the stuff we've been talking about, and a cycle. So it's some kind of life, earth, water, air, chemistry cycle. How does that make sense? What in the heck does this thing even mean? So I'm going to kind of walk you through an example of one of these cycles, and I think once you see it and understand it, the word in general will mean a lot more to you. So that's how we're going to start here today, trying to understand these big terms and a biogeochemical cycle. And we're going to start with a rock that I previously talked about. We're going to start with the rock limestone. All right, so limestone is a very common rock. It's usually whitish or maybe kind of yellowish brownish in color. And this is the rock that you can see in this picture, and it's pretty common rock on Earth. About 5 to 10% of the Earth's surface is actually covered in limestone, And a significant chunk of Texas is also covered in limestone. And limestone is actually made up of crushed seashells, so that's how this rock is made. In some places of the world, you have a lot of shells. In shallow seas and in oceans, you have lots of different clams and oysters and snails, all these things that have shells. And when they die and they pile up on the bottom of the ocean, they can make limestone. There's some other ways that limestone can be made as well, but that's the general idea. So you might have a tough time imagining how this could happen. Coral is also an example of something that is made of the same chemical as limestone. So in coral reefs and in places that have lots and lots of shells, and coccolithophores we'll get to in a second, when these pile up on the bottom of the ocean, over time, it creates a sedimentary rock that we call limestone. And, you know, these shells are whitish in color, so it's not too hard to imagine that that's why limestone is so white in color. These are pretty common in certain places in the world with the right kind of characteristics and temperatures. You get places in the world where there are so many of these different life forms, these clams and snails and stuff, so many of them that they pile up onto beaches, and there's hardly any sand on the beach. It's mainly just this crushed up piles of shells. And over time, these piles on top of each other, layer after layer of these shells getting crushed down on top of each other, can make a rock. Additionally, there are some places in the world where there are these massive blooms of plankton. And if you didn't know what a plankton are, those are these tiny little creatures that float around in the water. And one type of plankton, it's a very long word, coccolithophores, which you can see what they look like here on the right side of your screen. They are so abundant and so present in the water that you can actually see them from space. So all in this picture here on the left is actually a satellite photo. You can see some mountains and land and green land over on the left. And what you're seeing on the right, all the blue area, is actually ocean. So for example, this entire photograph is probably 250 miles wide. And all of this whitish swirly stuff is actually plankton. And each one of these little planktons actually are made of tiny little seashells, similar to clams and snails. And eventually all these will die and sink to the bottom of the ocean, and that will also result in limestone formation. So what are limestones and seashells actually made of? And this is a chemical that we've already talked about in this class, and that chemical is calcium carbonate. And as a reminder of this chemical, let me throw it over to myself at the virtual lab table.
All right, so let's talk about the chemistry of limestone. And this is limestone right here. It's a very common rock in Texas. I got this chunk of rock near San Antonio. So this is a Texas piece of limestone. And I want to talk a little bit about the chemistry of limestone. And limestone is made of a familiar substance to us. If you've been watching the last couple of labs and lectures, it's made of calcium carbonate. And if you remember, that's the same as Tums. Something else you might have remembered is that Tums is a weak base. So when we did the pH test on Tums, we found it was a weak base, which means that it will react with an acid. All right, to show that this rock, limestone, is indeed calcium carbonate in a base, let's go ahead and add some hydrochloric acid to it. See what happens. So you can see the little bubbles in the fizz. And to a lower extent than the baking soda, we see a similar reaction between hydrochloric acid and limestone. And just for the sake of comparison, let's see what happens if we do the same thing to Tums. We can see fizzles there as well, because it's all the same.
All right, so just to review that information, yes, calcium carbonate is a base. It's the same substance that seashells and limestone and chalk and Tums antacid. It's all the same stuff. And when it reacts with an acid, it will kind of bubble and create all those little gas bubbles that you see and kind of fizz. And this is the reaction that's undergoing. You have calcium carbonate on the left mixing with those hydrogen ions of the acid to produce calcium, which can mix with whatever else is available in the solution, carbon dioxide, and water. Now, in the world, on Earth, we have lots of limestone all over the Earth, right? 10% of the surface rock on Earth is limestone. But you might not know this, is that rain is actually acidic. We learned over our virtual lab, our last virtual lab, that rain, that water, when you add carbon dioxide to it, will become acidic, and that makes an acid called carbonic acid. And as rain is falling through the air, there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and these two chemicals mix, the water in the rain and the carbon dioxide in the air, and that forms a weak acid for rain. So all rain is actually slightly acidic. If there is a lot of pollution around, like a city that has maybe a coal power plant or something, and there's a lot of sulfur pollution or nitrogen pollution, the rain, the water as it's falling through the air can pick up some of that pollution and turn more acidic. And that's what is generally known as acid rain. But all rain is actually acidic, even if there is no pollution, just because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're talking a very weak acid. We're talking pH scale 5 to 5.5, typical for rain. When this acid rain that's falling out of the sky happens to land on limestone rock, it creates the same chemical reaction that we've been watching in class, an acid-base reaction. There is something else unique about this acid-base reaction that we can once again toss over to our virtual lab demo.
All right, so there is something else about this reaction that we're going to have to learn by watching it for a really long time. So let's see what happens. I have some crushed limestone here. And I'm going to pour hydrochloric acid over the top of it, and then we're just going to watch for a long time to see what happens to this limestone. So we're going to notice the bubbles and all that stuff like we had before, but let's take a look at what else happens. Alright, so what did we just watch happen? What we started with was a pile of rocks, a pile of limestone pebbles that kind of look like this, and after a couple hours in the acid, we got a pile that looks like this. And you can see a lot of the mass has actually disappeared from these rocks. So this is what we mean by dissolving. The calcium has actually been dissolved. During this reaction, the calcium carbonate bubbled away. Yes, that was part of the reaction, but another part of it was that the calcium atoms in the calcium carbonate dissolved into the water. And what we mean by dissolve is that in this water here is where I poured it all. You can see it's mostly liquid, but there are calcium atoms floating around in suspension here, and it would actually be completely clear if there wasn't some impurities to it. So we have learned something new about this reaction where when you mix a base like calcium carbonate with an acid like hydrochloric acid or carbonic acid, it will dissolve the calcium carbonate. These calcium atoms are not gone from the world. They don't truly disappear. Yes, we seem to lose mass, but no, that all of those atoms are still here. They're just dissolved into this water.
So yes, rain when it falls becomes acidic, and this actually will dissolve the limestone. So the chemical reaction between the acid and a base will actually dissolve the calcium in the limestone into the water, and over time, if acid rain hits limestone long enough, we see that it will dissolve over time. And this unfortunately creates some nice zombie George Washington sculptures in the world, where over time, you know, the sculptor created a statue of out of limestone, and it looks great, but over time, as the rainwater hits it, it will dissolve the limestone away, resulting in pretty horrifying statues over time. And this tendency for dissolving when rainwater hits limestone is also what creates caves, which we will talk about in the next virtual lab. But what we mean by dissolve is that the calcium is actually still in the water, in the rainwater. So over time, as the rain hits these walls of this canyon, it dissolves away the limestone, and the calcium doesn't disappear. The calcium is in the water, dissolved in solution. Of course, all of these rivers, this particular river is called the Blanco River in Texas, and that means White River in English. And the reason it's called the White River is because all this calcium is dissolved in the river, creating this whitish kind of color to it. And of course, all these rivers leak down to the ocean. And so all this calcium that is dissolved in this water ends up in the ocean. And when it's in the ocean, that's where our friends, the seashells, come back into the picture. What clams and oysters and snails do is they pull this calcium out of the water, and they have these special cells and chemical reactions in those cells to remake calcium carbonate. So they pull carbon dioxide and calcium out of the ocean water to make their seashells. And of course, once they become seashells, eventually they'll die, pile back up to the bottom of the ocean, and make new limestone. And so what you've seen is that we've actually made a circle. We started with limestone, and we talked about how limestone is eroded by acid rain. The acid rain erodes the limestone, but it also dissolves calcium into the water, and then the rivers carry it back to the ocean. Marine life in the ocean, like our snails and clams and oysters, make shells from the calcium, and then unfortunately they die, as all things do. And then those shells fall to the bottom of the ocean and make new limestone. And we've learned a little bit about plate tectonics, but obviously the Earth's crust and rocks are constantly being moved and uplifted and crunched together, and some of that limestone will get pushed up onto land, and that gets you back to step one, where the rainwater will dissolve the limestone and yada yada yada. So this creates what we call a biogeochemical cycle. And now we can actually begin to see what this word actually means. Doesn't matter really where you start, but you go from limestone in the geosphere. Limestone is a rock, so we would say it's a geosphere. When it's dissolved by rain, it is carried down to the ocean. And when it moves down to the ocean, these marine organisms, our clams and snails and oysters, will pick up that calcium out of the water to make their shells. And unfortunately, they're going to die eventually, and they're going to make new limestone. And then the limestone, you can see it just makes a circle. And so that's what we really mean by this cycle. This is an ongoing process. What's actually moving are the atoms of calcium. And we say it's a cycle because these calcium atoms are trapped in a circle, and they have been trapped in this circle since just about the beginning of Earth. I mean, at least for 600 million years, since we've had sea creatures that have used calcium carbonate in their bodies. And these calcium atoms, every calcium atom in the world just about is either in limestone right now or is in a marine organism, some kind of seashell. And the calcium in the limestone might stay there for a while, but eventually it'll be dissolved by acid rain, and those atoms will move to the ocean where they'll be reincorporated into marine organisms, and eventually they'll be remade into new limestone again. And this just goes on and on pretty much forever, and has been going on. So now if we come back to this this big word one last time, let's give you an official definition here. Biogeochemical cycle is anytime something like an element or a molecule or any type of matter shifts between the different spheres on Earth. So the biosphere, the geosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the cryosphere, anytime there are any atoms or molecules or elements that are moving back and forth between these things, we call that a biogeochemical cycle, just like we talked about with calcium today. Snails have calcium, the snails will die, they'll be turning into rock, the rock will be dissolved away by acid rain, that'll go back to the ocean, which ends up in more seashells. It just goes on and on forever, and that is what a biogeochemical cycle is. So it is a very complex idea, and I think I started this lecture saying that, you know, once you understand this, you kind of see the world as a little differently, and we are going to add to that and expand on that idea in our next several video lectures when we talk about some other biogeochemical cycles. So I hope you learned something, and have a great day. See y'all later.
It's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.